Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the launch of this very important report. I'm going to introduce Ambassador Tony Wayne, who's going to give us a few remarks, and that will be followed by the author's presentation, Ambassador Jim Michel. We're going to have some PowerPoint slides. So, Ambassador Wayne, please come and give your remarks to the panel.
Thanks, Ramita. Thanks, everybody, for coming here. There's plenty of space if we want to move closer together. Go on up. I encourage that. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to help introduce this discussion of a tremendously important topic, what we call fragile states. And Jim Michel has written an excellent paper analyzing the various proposals for how to consider fragile states, looking at the work that's been done by various donor countries and institutions, the United States, the European Union, the UN, many others, and he's done a wonderful job of putting together the various approaches, including some excellent non-governmental thinking about how we should consider fragile states and consider our approach to these states. There are a number of things that jump out at this, a lot of interesting things, and Jim's going to tell us a bunch about it. And then we're going to have some comments from Joseph Hewitt and Laurel Patterson that will spur what I think will be a very lively discussion for you all to join in looking at this topic. I just want to add from my perspective, spending many years as a U.S. diplomat and policy official and having to deal with fragile states, this is a really big topic and something that the United States really hasn't gotten its arms around effectively, as neither have a lot of other countries and institutions. The first big example of what I think we would call a fragile state that I had to deal with directly was the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and the emergence of a number of fragile entities fighting with each other, fighting within themselves, and the United States trying to respond to that, the Europeans trying to respond to that, and really struggling to figure out what do you do to help recreate, get past a sense of fragility, and not just the fighting, but beyond that, the kind of economic integration, the kind of development of institutions that function well. And then, as you all know, pardon me, we've been for much of this century dealing with instances of fragility all around the world. Afghanistan and Iraq, I had a lot of experience dealing with. Colombia, even in my last post in Mexico, not the most fragile of states, but a state with elements of fragility, clearly that need to be worked on. And that's one of the key things from Jim's discussion that comes along is it's not that we have one group of states that are all fragile and everything else is over here. It's a continuum. And on that continuum, you can have states that function pretty normally in a number of areas, but show signs of serious fragility problems in a couple of areas. And maybe that is within their own state or doesn't have a lot of impact outside. But then at the other end of the continuum, you have a set of states that are clearly very fragile, and they're having big impact not only in the country but in the region. And that impact can be in the form of migrants and refugees, in the form of terrorism, in the form of organized crime, and many other potential impacts which Jim talks about in his study. And it's really challenging. It's not only challenging for whoever happens to be an authority in that state, but it's challenging for those who want to help correct this situation to figure out how to do that. And I've seen just in my own experience tremendous amounts of hard work, of dedication and energy by officials from many countries trying to figure out what's the best way that we can get this back on a more normal path. What can we impact and what can't we impact? We were having a little discussion ahead of time about the idea of nation building or not, and sort of people pulling back from nation building, because it's really hard to build a nation, and nations really have to be built by the nationals of that future nation. But there are things that others can do to help along the way, and they can make a big difference in helping countries come along. But you've got to figure out how to do it, what tools to use. You have to be very coordinated in doing that, and that's some of the things that Jim points out in his paper, that this whole of government, or maybe whole of international community approach is really important. And that demands levels of coordination that previously haven't been seen in most cases. That was certainly true for the U.S. government. And I saw that get better and develop from the 1990s through the first 2000s, up until now. But then you have to take that in countries where you have many international actors, and as Jim points out, there are more international actors around these days than there might have been 20 or 30 years ago, so it makes it harder to coordinate that. But you really do need that kind of coordination. And you need to coordinate not only between the international actors, but you need to find ways to start giving more responsibility and lead to local actors, to actors in that country that's being affected by that. It makes it really, really challenging. There's a whole lot that they're going to talk about that I could go into here, but let me just focus on one particular thing that jumped out at me from the paper. Jim points out that a lot of people argue, and very cogently, that it's better to be preventive than to be reactive. And most of our international interventions have been reactive. After something explodes, after tens of thousands of people flow out, or maybe sadly are killed, or terrorist groups are operating out of a country uncontrolled and affect others, then we react to that and we intervene. So people thinking about this wisely say, well, let's be preventive about it. Let's see when things are getting dangerous. Let's tell people and then let's act. Well, that's a really hard thing to do. Just in the U.S. government, I know over the past 10 years, a little more than that, people have been trying to develop various mechanisms to have warning signs, to get groups together to talk about when a country's getting near something bad, really bad happening, and then trying to get the attention of policymakers to actually put the resources into that. It's not easy to do because policymakers at a national level, heads of international organizations, they've got a lot of stuff to do. They usually don't have enough resources to do what they're already doing. How do you get that? How do you mobilize to get that buy-in for preventive actions? A really, really hard topic. I hope our colleagues will say a little bit about that as they get into this discussion, but it is such a big discussion. And just finally, to end on, Jim notes at the end of his paper how important it is to have international leadership in dealing with these fragile state situations, and how important it is to have sufficient resources to be able to deal with these situations. We're clearly at a period of time where both of those are in question internationally. I happen to still think the United States could provide and can provide very important leadership in this effort, but it has to be willing to do so. And it has to be able to dedicate the resources that are needed to intervene in these situations. And right now, it's not too clear to me the answer to either of those questions if we're willing to step up in either of these situations. But it also seems to me that, having observed this around the world in the 90s and the thousands, that the cost you pay with the exploding fragile state situation is often a lot higher than what you would have invested if you went in early and tried to help manage that situation. So with that, let me turn it over to Jim to present some thoughts on his paper, and then we'll look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you very much.
Tony, thanks very much. I really appreciate your being here today to open this, and you bring such experience and perspective to the subject. I also want to express appreciation to CSIS. Dan Rundy, who heads the Project on Prosperity and Development, is traveling, but Dan encouraged me and made a commitment to support this, and he's followed through every step of the way, and that really has gotten it going. And Dan got it going, and then he asked Romina to be sure that it got from being a manuscript to being a publication, and here it is. So enough said about what she has done. She did everything that had to be done to get this finished. And I want to mention with special appreciation to Sundar Ramanujam, who was right there in the front, who has gotten us from having something that we talked about informally to having this very nice event here at CSIS. So thanks to all of the people at CSIS who've been so helpful. The report tries to do three things. To remind that fragility is important, a real threat to both security and development. There it is. Okay, it tries to describe the international response that has often been fragmented and uncertain and less effective than it should be. And it proposes ways in which we can better manage fragility and promote resilience. Now, there's a historic background in which we have seen over a long time gradual diminution of violence in societies around the world, and not there yet. Not there yet. Okay. And we have seen improvements in the welfare of people who inhabit this world. Steven Pinker is known in particular for having traced the decline of armed conflict and other violent behavior. And we've seen, which one does it? Which one does it?
Just let me get this.
Which one?
So this right arrow.
The right arrow.
Yeah.
Okay. So, we're too far. It's not. Okay, there's the armed conflicts. You can see they were going down, and then in the last couple of years we had a little spike in them. Homicides, we have seen them come down, and then not so much in the developed countries, which are the bottom line on that chart, but in the middle income countries, which are the top line, they kind of came down and then went up again. So this is disturbing. And it is particularly disturbing, this is really sensitive, when you look at the spike that we have seen in terrorism. The increase in deaths from terrorism really shot up, and then you can see in 2014 there was a peak, and they started to come down again in 2015 and 2016. But still, that's quite an increase in terrorism. Now, it's not terrorism all over the world. There are big regional differences. In the Arab countries of the Middle East, you have 5% of the world's population and 20% of the battle deaths. In Latin America, you have 8% of the global population and 33% of the homicides. In 2016, 3/4 of the deaths from terrorism took place in 5 countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Syria. Now, along with those trends in violence, you have trends in improved well-being. You have more democracy, freedom, and less autocracy in the world. You have income growth. What happened? Yeah, whoops. You have income growth that has taken off. It started, of course, in Western Europe. And over the years, over the last couple of hundred years, now you see the line has gone up in Africa. And you're seeing income going up in all the regions. As Steve Radelet said in his book, The Great Surge, never before have we seen such substantial improvements in income, poverty, health, education, and governance all at the same time. Angus Deaton's book similarly makes that kind of an observation. Now, what is fragility? What does this have to do with these trends and how they may evolve? Well, there is no definition, and that's maybe a beginning point to recognize how tough this issue is. We can't define it. Everybody has their own definition. But we can agree, I think, on a lot of characteristics that are common where there's pretty substantial fragility. And so we see the poor governance, limited institutional capacity, low social cohesion, weak legitimacy, and these are all characteristics that make a society at risk of being unable to cope and being vulnerable to bad things: insecurity, poverty, conflict, forced migration, maybe becoming a refuge for criminal organizations or terrorists. So what do you do about this? One approach is to label some countries as fragile and use a set of criteria of economic and social indicators and rank their fragility. My report describes the definitions and the methodologies and the lists of the so-called fragile states that this approach has produced, but labeling is problematic. For one thing, it produces a negative reaction from a labeled country. If you go into a country and say, we're here to help you because you're fragile, and John Norris wrote a paper in which he said that the countries that get labeled that way think they're going to get less help because they're labeled. And there's a difficult relationship right off the bat with that. Second, it tends to direct the international attention to the most severe examples of fragility and away from preventive measures to mitigate negative trends and preserve resilience. So I think a better approach is to regard fragility as a multifaceted phenomenon with economic, environmental, political, security, and social dimensions, and it affects many countries to varying degrees in many ways. So instead of binary, fragile, non-fragile, we can look at countries as situated at different points along a continuum between crisis and resilience and on different trajectories. And the focus can be more on present conditions and trends and less on type of country. And the emphasis can be more on prevention, and that's what I've urged in the report. Now, there are a couple of the organizations that have adopted definitions that reflect that view of a continuum and reflect that notion of varying manifestations in different situations. Much of the information compiled, though, about fragility is presented in terms of the traditional terminology, fragile states. And so I've used some of that research and those statistics to talk about some of the consequences of fragility. An important indication of the threat of fragility is the relationship to poverty. This is a Brookings study, and it shows that the much celebrated decline in global poverty hasn't been so evident in the most fragile environments, and it's growing. The gap is growing. The OECD thinks that by 2035, we'll see 80% of the world's extremely poor people living in the 56 countries that they examined in their States of Fragility report. And an interesting footnote is that of those 56 countries, 29 of them are middle-income countries. So it's not all poor countries that are becoming the concentration points of fragile conditions, and with that, poverty. Another correlation is that the countries at the top of the major lists of fragility, that first column is the first 10 countries on the the Fragility Index, Fragile States Index, and the others then are the Global Peace Index and the Global Terrorism Index. And so those at the top of the Fragility Index happen to be at the bottom of the Global Peace Index and at the top of the Terrorism Index. Countries that are afflicted with poverty, conflict, and terrorism are also principal sources for the flow of refugees and displaced persons out of their homes. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees says there's 65.5 million people now who have been displaced. So this suggests that there ought to be an international response. Well, there has been, and it has been fueled by several concerns. One is that fragility is diminishing the funding that is available for development because of growing humanitarian needs. The second is that the effectiveness of aid is lower in the countries that are being left behind because of fragile situations. And third, and I think most important in terms of getting global attention, is the spreading conflict, disease, and crime, and terrorism, and migration that has come to be associated with fragility, and especially in the post-9/11 world. Now, did I jump one too many? Yes, I did. The complexity. I'm sorry, I've got too many things going on here with the clicker. The complexity of fragility, the mix of security and development and resource concerns, the variety of fragile situations, the many different perspectives of all the international and local actors make this really difficult. And an effective response requires country-specific efforts in highly diverse situations, and it requires a lot of actors coming together who have differing mandates and capabilities and perspectives and expertise. And there are frequent tensions among the security concerns, the development objectives, other diplomatic interests, the political and the budgetary constraints, and those all get in the way of the coherence and the coordination that is needed for effective responses. The report examines the experience of a number of entities, the United States, the European Union. It looks at the multilateral New Deal of the international dialogue on peace building and state building. It looks at the United Nations, the OECD, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and regional development banks. And it looks at the private sector. And it finds that all of these actors did some thoughtful analysis. They made some well-intentioned efforts. They had some positive results, but they all had difficulties in optimizing the effectiveness of what they were doing. And the pattern was pretty general, that there would be experience, and the experience would lead to studies, and the studies would lead to new policies, then there would be an evaluation of the new policies, and the problems would be found, and then you'd have a new cycle. And you find these studies over and over and new policies being implemented and evaluated. And meanwhile, the fragility continues. So in summary, we know that fragility contributes disproportionately to the world's violence, to the instability and the poverty and the forced displacement. We know that fragile situations erode social contracts and diminish resilience. We know that this is all a threat to peace and stability and sustainable development, but we haven't come up with the answer. And this is what the Fragility Study Group concluded, speaking primarily about the United States, but making the point that it's not limited to the United States, that we really do not have a clear or shared view on how best to address fragility. So we have, however, in all of this experience, learned a lot of things. We've learned that it's better to concentrate on specific aspects of fragility rather than on labeling. We have learned, as Pauline Baker, who is here, suggests, that a small number of factors are typically associated with increased risks of conflict and can be singled out for concentrated attention, things like political legitimacy, group grievances, macroeconomic performance. Focusing on a few priorities that way is less likely to overtax the local resources. It is less likely to strain the coordination capability of all the actors. And it is important because the focus can look at what can be done, what is feasible, what is politically possible in the context, and it can build trust and empower local ownership and increase local responsibility, which is key. Now, a focus on priorities doesn't mean that you can look at this only as a development or only as a security or only as a political issue. It still requires the attention of all the aspects of the situation. It still requires coordination that is context-specific and whole of government. Michael Crosswell, who I think is here somewhere, has made the point that weak capacity that is due to a lack of resources can be addressed with financial and technical assistance. But the development approach, international assistance, doesn't do the job when the problem is a lack of political commitment. And you need to have effective measures beyond aid to deal with power asymmetries, with incentives, with preferences, and look at this more as a whole of government challenge than it is a development or alternatively security or alternatively diplomatic. There's a strong preference in principle for early warning and preventive measures, but that works only if the early warning leads to early action. We've had systems, but the systems don't always produce results other than knowledge of a problem is about to happen and then it happens. Transitions from fragility, while they require early action to get in there, the transition takes a long time. And it's necessary to maintain efforts until progress becomes sustainable. I use the example because it's one I know in the report of Central America, where the wars ended, the Cold War ended, and we stopped paying attention. And look at them now. It didn't stay through the point of sustainability. The report suggests ways in which these lessons learned can be incorporated in relationships within governments, cross agencies, among international actors and relationships, and the relations with the developing countries that are encountering fragility issues. And the structure draws on the strategic, systemic, selective, and sustained policy framework that was adopted by the Fragility Study Group. So I wound up at the end then with recommendations for the United States that might be pulled out of this, and I'll close with those. First of all, that the U.S. should regard fragility not as a specialized area, but as a mainstream issue that we should address in our relations with other countries as we do other cross-cutting issues like human rights or economic policies. That U.S.-wide, government-wide strategies will require an effective coordination mechanism. I think that probably has to be under NSC auspices to pull all of the different agencies together. But I think the implementation of basic strategies within the government should be delegated to agencies and offices that have the primary responsibility for relations with the country or the region in question. When you have offices with specialized expertise, they can come in and supplement, but if they try to replace the normal channels of diplomacy and development and security cooperation, my experience is you wind up with trouble. The U.S. should seek flexible budget authority, and this is tough. Congress likes to put money in boxes. Say, you can use this money for that, what's in that box, and that money for what's in that box. But these are very unpredictable situations where you're trying to help countries figure out what they can do for themselves, and they're going to have an iterative process where they start one way, then they have to back up and go another way. You're going to have to be able to adapt as circumstances change, and you have to need a continuity of effort. So this is going to require more flexible budget authority, perhaps with increased reporting to keep Congress better informed, but it really does need a more flexible budget. I think that the U.S. should be investing in human capacity in all of the concerned agencies, in the skills that are relevant to addressing fragility as a mainstream issue. That means collaborative management skills. It means language proficiency. It means availability for long assignments. It means training. It means having incentives and opportunities for career advancement for people who are willing to take on some of these tough assignments. I think the U.S. should have a fragility early warning system, just as we have a famine early warning system that has been pretty successful in calling attention to situations where action often does follow. We have had, the Political Instability Task Force, which was kind of a mixed bag of professors and intelligence offices, and a fragility early warning system based more on the famine early warning system, and I would suggest managed by aid, which knows how to manage things like that, would be a very good tool. And the U.S. should provide leadership to strengthen the international response to fragility. And I have a couple of things that could be done there. One is we have the New Deal structure of self-assessment and then compacts based on the national planning that comes out of the self-assessment. But it's tried to do too much. And you could have a few very streamlined compacts under the New Deal that focus on key issues that emphasize mutual responsibility and accountability, and that look beyond aid relationships and take into account the whole range of issues of economic, political, and security. And second thing we could do is encourage greater harmonization among the multilateral institutions. At present, the World Bank and the IMF have one policy for low-income countries and another policy for medium-income countries. And one is a fragile state, and the other one is a fragile situation. And that complicates things. When they do their evaluations, it's hard to figure it out. I think that we could help to shape the outcomes of some major upcoming UN events. There's a General Assembly meeting in late April of this year on sustaining peace that really is the effort by the Secretary General to bring together the issues of human rights and peace and development with a central focus on prevention. And noting that everybody talks about it, again, prevention, not everybody was willing and ready to do it. A second major opportunity that will come along is the high-level political forum on sustained development, which meets once every 4 years at the head of state General Assembly level. And that meeting is going to come up in 2019, and it's going to focus on Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals, about justice and safe societies and stability and all of the issues. The SDG 16 is the fragility goal. Ultimately, as the report points out, more effective and integrated policies and coherent strategies are going to depend on the readiness of political leaders and concerned publics to believe that this effort is worthwhile and that it has a chance of success. I hope the report contributes to making that case, and I hope that many of you who are here today will participate in making it as well. So thank you for your interest, and I look forward to the ideas of the panelists and to a lively discussion with all of you on this important subject. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Michel. We're now going to have two discussants of the report. Laurel Patterson. Can you hear me? Yep. Laurel Patterson is Senior Policy Advisor for Crisis, Fragility, and Resilience from United Nations Development Program, UNDP. And Joseph Hewitt is Vice President for Policy, Learning, and Strategy at the United States Institute of Peace. You'll have about 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up. I'll pose some questions to the panelists. You can
Okay. Good. I'll keep going. Just weren't sure who was going first here. Well, thank you. First of all, thanks to CSIS for inviting me to this great conversation, and congratulations, Jim. This is a terrific paper, and I've been in this business for quite a while, and I don't know of a better compendium of all of the issues that are relevant here than this one. So you've really done a service for all of us who follow this issue, and it's greatly appreciated. So next time somebody who's sort of new to the field says, what should I read to get caught up on this? I now have something to point them to. So that's really good. There's a lot of really good substance in here, and I would just to start off flag some of the things that I think are important. First of all, Jim makes this very compelling point, and you just heard it here, that fragility really has to be understood and measured on a continuum. And that is really vital, because first of all, the concept really is a concept about something that exists in gradations, and it does exist in different dimensions. It does have different dimensions. But the other part, the stigma of saying that a state is either fragile or not, is really a hindrance to making progress in this field. And just as Jim pointed out, once that stigma is attached to a state, it becomes very difficult, I think, to ask that state to partner with donors to move its, to execute a transition out of that state. A continuum makes much more sense for conceptual reasons and for political reasons. And so it's great that the report makes that point so compellingly. Another thing, Jim calls for taking a closer look at the New Deal and revitalizing that particular look or that particular approach for encouraging transitions out of fragility. The compact-based approach is an approach where fragile states are in partnership with donor states, in partnership built around principles of mutual accountability. That's, I think, the promise of moving these transitions forward is strongest. And so I'm really glad to see that. There were other points that, don't get everybody really excited, but they're very, very important. The point about investing in our human resources in fragile states. So if you're working in these places, the people who do the work need to be trained and equipped with the skills and competencies needed. And it's not enough to expect people to be jacks of all trade and just drop into a place like Somalia and apply the same skill set that they used in a place like, pick a sort of a wealthier place like Brazil, let's say, or a country that's further up on the development spectrum. They're not the same. They're different skill sets, and we should treat them as such. And I would add to that, let's not have people come into places like this and then only work for 12 months. I know that in the United States, in countries that we call critical priorities, the rotations are just 12-month rotations, which means that people are just starting to understand highly complex dynamics, and then they're leaving. So we really have to ask our people to be willing to stay longer, and equip them to do that. So that's a really important point to flag the human resources. And I'm from the U.S. Institute of Peace, so I can't resist myself. I have to say thank you for appreciating the Fragile States Study Group report and one of the big findings about how to build a strategic framework for engaging in fragile states around the 4 S's, which maybe that'll come up in the conversation. So that's, for me, just a highlight reel of some of the really important things that came out of the report. Just a few comments. Jim flags the multiplicity of definitions about fragility and how that's an impediment. That's a problem of getting to a shared understanding of what fragility is, the multiplicity of definitions. have led to a multiplicity of measures. I'm becoming less and less worried about that as time goes on. As we look at these measures, more and more there's convergence. In the report, Jim shows 3 or 4 results, 3 or 4 rankings from some well-known efforts. And if you look at them carefully, and you look at the top 15 or 20 countries or so, you'll see that most of them are in the top 15 or 20 across all of the lists. There isn't as much disagreement about which states exhibit the greatest amounts of fragility as there maybe once was, as these tools were a little bit more nascent and developing. But I think we've got to the point now where we're a little less surprised about which countries we're considering to exhibit the most fragility. So I'm starting to get to the point where I'm a little less worried about that, and maybe that's a sign of progress. It is definitely not, there's another point here, the multiplicity of measures is probably not the impediment to action that we might imagine it to be. Inside government, when a discussion might happen about, what should we do in such and such fragile state, the debate usually doesn't veer off to, well, this list doesn't say it's fragile. This list does. That's usually not the impediment in my experience. In my experience, the impediment has to do with disagreement about how to approach the country, disagreement about what tools should be brought to bear, what capabilities should be applied. The agreement usually is that, yeah, the country does exhibit fragility. We can quibble about how much, but there's usually agreement about the problems. The impediment is, what are the tools that we apply? How do we move that country forward? That's what I would say is more the impediment, not the multiplicity of measures. Jim highlights the importance of early warning. I completely agree. I'll just add on here a little bit. And the way I would add on is this. It's certainly very important to track countries that are fragile, and it's important to track how those fragility, the dimensions of fragility are changing, because that does happen. That happens, however, extremely slowly. What happens far more quickly in fragile states would be the onset of events that have the potential to trigger violence or major forms of instability. And so what we really need to do is, especially in places that are fragile, is think a little bit about how we're tracking different types of events that carry that potential for instability. Like, for example, oncoming political transitions. In Zimbabwe, we've been paying a lot of attention to what was going to happen with Mugabe. And with the understanding that this is a very fragile place, this transition that we're now in the middle of carries that potential for instability. An upcoming election that has a high potential for being contested in a fragile state, that has the potential for violence. So coupling our analysis of places that are fragile with an understanding of how local events that are coming up have the potential for triggering violence is probably the most robust kind of early warning system that we can build. And there are lots of elements of this already in place. We just have to keep investing in them and keep trying to pay attention to them. Just a couple of other points. So going back to the idea about a compact and what a compact means in order to help facilitate the transition out of fragility. There's general agreement that really well-functioning compacts are going to be built around mutual accountability. And I want to talk a little bit about why that's important. And especially accountability on the donor's part. The donor makes a set of commitments to a fragile country and says that if you follow through on a particular set of reforms, we'll continue to support you and so forth. That's sort of what the deal looks like in shorthand. Much depends on the country that's fragile being able to hold its end of the bargain. Much depends on that country's ability to make a political commitment. The capacity to make a political commitment however, is exactly the hardest thing that fragile countries have to do. It's very hard to hold political commitments. Political leaders typically have a tenuous hold on power. Defeats of any kind are going to make their political survival perhaps more difficult. And so political commitments are hard. So donors have to be aware of this as part of their deal, so to speak. And so one of the things that we have to start thinking about, and I don't have answers, but I can try to define the problem a little bit, is thinking about ways to provide some protection, if you will, or provide some, I'm not sure what the right word is, safe space perhaps, to allow leaders in fragile countries to make those commitments and then ultimately allow them to fail, because they will. They definitely will. The transition out of fragility is not going to be a linear one. The transition out of fragility is going to go in fits and starts. There will be setbacks. And if donors are unable to stay the course with them, maintain their commitment to whatever the compact looks like, it's going to be very difficult to usher that particular fragile country out of its state. And so there's a part of what a compact looks like that has a number of responsibilities in it or commitments for donor countries that are always going to be, I think, pretty essential. And so perhaps we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but I think that's something that we don't talk about as much as about the commitments that the fragile state itself is supposed to make as part of its transition. I'll finish with this. Jim put this challenge to all of us to think about. How do we change our frame to more of a prevention frame? We live in a world with, depending on how you count it up, probably about 60 countries that exhibit significant amounts of fragility. And at any given time, about 25 to 30 of them are in an active armed conflict. And of course, at any given moment, we're managing several humanitarian crises. How do we get ahead of all those countries that are on fire and start thinking about the ones that are vulnerable to catching on fire and using resources to do something about that? That's a very tough challenge, and we haven't solved it. Jim rightly points out that within our donor governments, the incentives favor those who can demonstrate immediate results. And the prevention challenge is not one that yields immediate results. Working on prevention doesn't yield evidence of success. It's sort of the absence of conflict is the evidence of success. And so it's very, very hard to prove you're doing something well. I'm going to insert a little parenthetical in this. The UN and the World Bank are coordinating on a conflict prevention report, is the way I refer to it. Forgive me while I steal some of your thunder. But the Pathways to Peace report, which the preview of came out in September, is a preview of a compendium of evidence about conflict prevention. The full report is going to be coming out in March. And it's going to have, I think, the same kind of consolidating effect on our field as like the 2011 WDR. It is going to be the reference that a lot of us will turn to about what evidence for conflict prevention looks like. And so while I make this point that it's very hard to point to evidence of conflict prevention, these guys have done it. And we'll have really a very nice presentation of that for all of us to soak up in about a month or so. So, sorry for stealing your thunder. So having said all of that, how do you get to a point where you can make a commitment to a prevention agenda? What does it look like to decide that you're going to work on 5 countries or 10 countries, some small amount of countries? I don't know if the form of that commitment comes in the form of legislation, where the legislative part of a government says to the government, look, it's a law. We are now going to organize our development assistance and our diplomatic interventions in such a way that we're going to try to prioritize countries that are vulnerable to conflict, that exhibit fragility, but are not yet on fire. And we're going to try to preserve resources to work on prevention that way. Perhaps it is some kind of commitment like that that's necessary to bind governments or to bind actors to move forward. But absent that commitment, to me, it's an open question then how you eventually get to that prevention agenda. So I look forward to talking about that during the Q&A. And again, Jim, thank you very much, and congratulations on a great report.
Great, thank you. Let me pick up on some of those points and also thank Jim for an excellent publication, the opportunity to be here. As was mentioned, the World Bank is holding a Fragility Forum in a couple of weeks' time. Jim, I think your report should be required reading for all the people that are going to descend on DC for that event. And during that event, well, on the margins of that event, we'll also be launching the full report on pathways for peace on the 6th of March. Let me pick up a couple of points and then really look forward to the Q&A from all of you. One of the interesting starting points in the report itself is looking at this increase in violence, and we're considering that and discussing, reflecting on that from several different angles. And really what we're seeing, what's different now, why now and not before. And part of that, as Jim points out as well, is that we're seeing greater interconnections, greater interconnectedness, and faster change. What does that look like? And others have been more eloquent in this than I could be. But what that looks like, what's different now than it was before, is a young boy living in a slum on the outskirts of incredible wealth with a mobile phone in his hand, connected fundamentally to the rest of the world, connected to what life looks like for other people around the corner, around the world, in a way that wasn't there before. What really came out strongly from the prevention, the Pathways to Peace study as well, what's driving this rise in violence, what's causing this escalation is grievance, exclusion, and inequality. And I think those are a lot of the sort of that focus of issues that you're talking about as well, to keep us really on top of where we need to focus our collective strengths. So for some of the things that we're thinking about related to that and how to make that case, part of what we think is important there is early warning, fundamentally early action, Jim, as you very rightly point out. And in that, identifying emerging and escalating risks. Okay? And what's important from our perspective is that we're doing that holistically. So the way that risks are often looked at in the past is we look at risk related to drought, risk related to earthquakes, risk related to violence associated with an election, exclusion, et cetera. What's been more difficult to do, but what's so fundamental to do in a world that is more interconnected and for which we're experiencing change much faster, is to be able to look at those risks holistically and identify the intersections and the interconnections between those risk factors. A reflection from some of the work that I had done in the past was on Ebola, a very complex emergency. One of the areas that was hardest to get on top of the Ebola epidemic was in Guinea. Why? The area of Guinea that was most affected by Ebola was an opposition-held territory, right had an election. Okay? So these factors interact with each other, and we know that implicitly. But the key, we think one of the keys is trying to identify the systems so that we can generate an evidence base more robust than we have in the past, not anecdotal, which is what I just did, to be able to measure how these factors are impacting each other. We're taking some inspiration, we were talking a little bit before, from the insurance sector, which is really at the forefront of identifying, measuring, and predicting risks, at least related to natural disasters. And they're seeing a shift from basing their predictive models on historical data, which is what they did in the past, to physics. And the reason why they've made this seismic, no pun intended, shift in approach is because what they find is using historical data is very, very good at predicting high frequency but low impact events. When you turn to the physics of earthquakes, of various fault lines, et cetera, you're able to more accurately predict less frequent events that have a higher impact. And those are the ones we're after, and those are the ones, Joe, I think you're also referring to, and what makes the real difference in some of these fragile contexts. So we're looking at ways that we can bring up to speed some of the data relating to conflict, to violence, et cetera, so that we can try to look in a more evidence-based and a more robust way at how these interact with each other. And I think that will make a more persuasive argument for supporting prevention and investing in a prevention approach. The other thing I think that taking a look at risks will do, we hope going forward, is open up to a more inclusive dialogue. In a lot of ways, we identify risks. We're not particularly keen to share all of those analysis and findings related to risk with the national government in a particular context. These can be very, very sensitive issues. We have some risk modeling tools. We're reluctant to open those to a public space because depending on how you work your way through the various indices, which are all open source, it does boil down to lists. You start looking at, well, who's more fragile than other, and this is a really difficult starting point to work with governments, to work with people, and to work with national stakeholders ultimately in their country against their development priorities for which we're supporting actors, not the main show. So I think what it does to look at risk and to look at a variability, a multiplicity, the multidimensionality of risk, or fragility factors, if you want to see it that way, allows you to have a different kind of discussion with a wider group of actors and maybe build those compacts, refresh the New Deal approach a little bit and be able to drive some different sets of solutions, which maybe we wouldn't have as immediately come to our mind in the past. And it goes without saying that Agenda 2030 also compels us to look at things this way. And to as much as we sort of drive forward in expertise in our various sectors, to look at the intersections between these things and the way that they impact each other going forward. So maybe one more word to say on prevention. One of the things that the report does as well, the Pathways for Peace report, is it creates a business case for prevention for the first time. And this is a pretty robust modeling. And it runs through a series of scenarios depending on how successful prevention is. And we talked earlier as well about the importance of having some tolerance for failure, which is very important. What it shows, the bottom line, is that even when prevention is the least likely to succeed, say it's most often fails, there's still a savings in monetary terms of about $5 billion. In the cases where prevention is the most successful, and the way we model that is about 70% of the time is successful, you see $70 billion plus in terms of the savings as a result of investing in preventions. So there is a business case, there is certainly a human case, and we hope, I mean, just maybe that one reflection that I wanted to share on risk is one way of developing a more robust evidence base and opening up to a different kind of discussion, which would let us be able to take that evidence, be able to take this work and turn that into early action.
Thank you, Joe and Laurel. I just have a follow-up question to Jim, and then I'm going to open up the floor for your questions. If you don't have copies of the report, there's extra copies at the end. I wanted to bring a human face to the event and ask Jim, what's the story behind the cover? This is a very, striking picture that we chose, and we went back and forth. And what's the story that you wanted to convey?
Well, this cover. Thank you. This cover, Tony will recognize this. This is the parliament in Afghanistan, and they are voting down President Karzai's cabinet because of issues of corruption. And we didn't do this. They did it. They made those votes. And you will see that it is in a public event because you have the camera there. You see that you have women and men participating in this legislative decision. And it, to me, was a hopeful message that in a fragile environment, that it was possible to have a demonstration of resilience that you could hope will be a path toward the future rather than an exception. And so that was what appealed to me about it.
Great. I don't know if you have any reactions to the comments. If not, we're going to, we have about 25 minutes left for public Q&A. There are there are mics in the back, and please just state your name and affiliation. The gentleman here, the lady in the back, in the middle. Yes. There. It's not on. Oh, there.
Okay.
That's the button that says on.
Yeah.
Ambassador Michel, first of all, thank you so much for this effort, and thanks to CSIS for supporting it. It's really an important topic. I have a question that has to do with what you might call our sustainability strategy, given questions about local actors and the legitimacy of local actors. We're all probably familiar with one of the critiques of our development industry is that we oftentimes look at it as a way of tweaking things around the edges. The instrumentalist or instrumentalism, it's actually a word if you look it up, instrumentalism approach is that we can kind of figure out how to fix things, and we go in and we fix them. And one of the critiques of that is that it's not as cognizant and aware and appreciative of local power, political power, and in the case of fragility, it's oftentimes more than political power, it's military power as well, and so on. So my question is, in terms of the research and the reading and the discussions that you've had, how do we balance what we consider an ideal approach for creating stability and the power and legitimacy of local actors? Because oftentimes their view of the right way forward, and oftentimes the view of their followers, is not necessarily our view. So I'm just curious about some of the perspectives that you might have on that challenge when working in a fragile state setting.
We'll take one more question, and then we have a chance to answer. The lady in the middle. The lady in the middle.
Again, thank you very much. I'm Marilyn Barrett from George Washington University, and I've also had the privilege of knowing Jim Michel through some work with the USAID Alumni Association. Just very recently, in the last few minutes, you, Laurel, addressed the thing of what do preventive measures do in terms of bringing down the risk. And you characterize this in terms of the amount of money that might be saved in terms of reaching, I presume, some form of recovery. And I'd like to ask your thoughts, if you have given any thought to certain kinds of things which are not monetized, but for example, the health of young children, or reaching an education, or things that, how much time is involved and what kinds of developmental things are going on. That I think that's important.
Okay. So, would you like to answer one of the
Okay. Yes. It's a tough question about sustainability. Well, I have over time come to be more and more a strong advocate for local ownership and working with local systems. And if the situation is one of resistance, and it is the resistant fragile environment that is the most difficult. It is where we could all in this room agree that something should be done, and we could take it to somebody who is in power and whose power is threatened by that thing, and it won't happen because it interferes with that power situation. And it seems to me, as the World Development Report last year made the point, that power asymmetries have to be dealt with in a complicated way that involves incentives, involves public awareness, that involves, yes, external influence. We sometimes have situations where we provide foreign assistance on some people in a country, and we impose economic sanctions on other people in the same country. Libya is an example of that. And it seems to me we have to work through that in a way that respects ultimately the local responsibility and the local ownership, or it won't be sustainable. So there's no simple answer. I mean, it's going to be different in every context. But I think that has to be kind of a guiding light in trying to deal in difficult situations. Somebody was suggesting in our earlier discussion that we had before the formal session that you are really undermining local ownership when you come in and provide something that can be done that they can't do. And it weakens their ability then to become the owners of their future. So that's a very vague general answer, but I think it's all I can say. As to Marilyn Merritt's question on preventive measures, I think we said that not only is it a money-saving thing, but of course, I think it is. The situation that you're trying to prevent is one that would be a disaster, a tragedy for a lot of people. And that has to be upfront, I think, in terms of justifying making the investment in prevention. But also it is I think you're preventing the risk of spreading of a bad thing happening here. I mean, look at the situation, war in Syria. You know, well, it's not just Syria anymore. It's spreading around. And who are the participants in that? Many more. Prevention avoids getting to a point where you have a very, very dangerous situation if you prevent it at an earlier stage. So I think there are several arguments. Measurement, that's hard. But I think you have legitimate arguments that prevention is better than waiting for a bad thing to happen and then reacting to it on many levels.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree entirely. It's really tricky, and it's too bad that the first argument is the financial one, you know, because I agree with you. I mean, ultimately, you're preventing suffering and loss that can take root, as we're seeing in Syria, other places, and affect for generations and spread across regions, et cetera. So the measuring of it is difficult. The report does point to a couple of areas that can be zeroed in on from a prevention perspective, so that as you're walking down what is a long pathway, in many cases to violent conflict, what are the sorts of things that you can identify and act on early, and how can we get better at measuring those and sort of dealing with grievances related to land, for example, and land ownership and so on. So those are some practical steps along the way. The other thing that the report shows, which I found really compelling, having worked in some of these areas, as many of you have, is that we also look at the challenges of recovering from violent conflict once it starts. And these are really tragic figures that I think should speak to us as well. After a year of experiencing violent conflict, which is measured by more than a certain number of deaths in a combat situation, it becomes something like 27% less likely that you'll be able to recover. By the second year, you're over 50%. As you get closer to 5 years, I think you're above 70% less likely to be able to return to a state of stability. So yeah, there's a number of powerful ways of trying to make that argument for prevention beyond the monetary.
All right. I'd like to get back, just to say a quick thing about the first question about strategies, you know, sustainability strategies and working in places where there are deficits in legitimacy. I think it's a really important question. And just to add to Jim's points, which I really agree with, there's not a temptation, but the way often development actors work in places where there are major deficits in legitimacy. So specifically what that might mean, governing institutions are governing in ways that are not inclusive. They are explicitly marginalizing some groups and keeping them from political space. Maybe there's a lack of accountability in governing institutions at all levels. That's what I think illegitimacy looks like. And they're hard problems to work on. I mean, it's very hard to change those in any way overnight. So what do? A lot of times what we do is we just work in other lanes. You know, we can still do things like, you know, other kinds of development programming that doesn't get at the governance kinds of issues. We might do things to promote local security. We might do things like water projects. We might do things like build roads and deliver these kinds of public goods. And one of the dangers to that, even though those are good things, sort of all things being equal, is that you reinforce the dynamics of illegitimacy as a development actor, because you're doing that kind of with the government in some way. And you're actually not doing anything to really remedy the part of the social contract that's broken in that place. And so what a fragility agenda gets you is more mindfulness, I think, about the kind of, I'll call it harm, that you might be doing when you do development work in places that exhibit fragility in the legitimacy lane, but you sort of disregard that and work more in these other lanes. You might actually inadvertently be making things worse, or at least reinforcing something that's not going well. So I would just add that to the mix.
Yes. So there are the gentleman here and the lady in the white and black dress.
Thank you. Bob Berg, Alliance for Peace Building. Thank you, Jim, for another outstanding report. I'm thinking about its use not only in the multilateral context, but in our own budgetary context, and the cut of $2 billion in humanitarian aid, not to speak of UNDP and USIP cuts, so we're hoping that it will help the defense. An imperative now from the White House and in AID is to reduce the number of countries that receive aid. And my own personal worry is that instead of lopping off the richest and most capable countries, that the least able and poorest countries, such as was in your top 10 list, are going to be cut to aid the numbers game. And I'm wondering whether you have some suggestions, Jim, particularly, on how AID should consider the endangered, fragile states as they consider which countries to continue assistance with. Does it trump considerations of poverty? Is it a separate calculus? Do you get added points? I mean, how do you reconcile these two very important considerations?
Hi, my name is Sasha Kishan-Chand. I worked with the Fragile and Conflict Affected States program in the UK, and most recently returned from Turkey, where we were working on Syria, building the local capacity, the local councils. And having started out in a think tank policy kind of career and then going into field implementation, I hear brilliant ideas, but having transitioned into implementing them, I found that they can be very unrealistic, very accurate, very thoughtful, but when it comes to being on the ground, being able to actually implement everything we're talking about today is under-resourced, under-recognized. What might we be able to do about that?
Junior, you want to start?
I think you need to get together with Bob Berg. I think that his point about the budget and your point about implementation is hard, have a lot to do with each other. But that's maybe the easy way to try to answer those two questions. There is a sense sometimes that selectivity of the winners is a better strategy for assistance to other countries. And I think that it makes sense to have some part of your budget set aside to reward countries that are good performing countries. And I think MCC has done some very good work in helping countries that were doing well do better. But that's, what is it? What do they get? A little over $1 billion these days, about right? Out of roughly 30 billion in in development assistance. That's good. That's a good thing. But you can't make that your whole program, because the needs are greater in the weaker environments. And I would suggest that in some ways the risks are higher, all kinds of risks. And so I think that we need to have maybe more dialogue with the policymakers and with Congress about that. I don't know what will be persuasive, but it seems to me that it's attractive to think, well, we'll help the ones who are helping themselves. Well, those are the people you want to help. They're the deserving ones, and that's not the right analysis. It's not who deserves more. It's what are our interests in providing support to other countries, and there's a variety of interests. Especially for a country like the United States that is a world leader. It's not just to pick the winners, and it's not just to save the ones at the edge of survival, but it is to provide a number of things that have to do with a better globe that we want to live in, and we want others to live in. So I think maybe this needs to be talked out some more with policy makers and with policy leaders. You said that implementation is hard, and one of the things you said that's hard about it is it's underfunded. What I'm saying in the report is that there should be investment in human resources by the agencies that carry out work in difficult environments. And that's easy to say. As to what will convince them to do it, I do think there is a similarity of a challenge that you face and that you face. The UK, on its work in bringing the development program, which a couple of years ago decided they were going to spend 50% of their total budget in fragile environments, with a collaborative relationship with FCO and defense, working together with pooled resources was a great step forward. I don't know what's happening to that, but we haven't come anywhere close to that kind of coherence in our own structure for trying to work in these difficult environments.
I was working with them during that transition, and so it was similar to how we created. So I was there for that transition in 2015 is when I was working for them, and it went from FCAS, Fragile and Conflict Affected States, to CSSF. And that's when they combine the agency efforts and the resources. But one of the things about my experience during that time is they're very risk averse about actually being in the field, so they operated through subcontractors who were ready to actually sit down in Somalia or wherever, and so it was complicated. So the thing that I am asking about is how do we take the great thinking from think tanks and policy wonks, if you want to call them that, to actual implementable solutions and make it work on the ground. Because when you're on the ground, all these great ideas aren't practical. So that was basically my question. A very non-diplomatic version of it.
I very much appreciate the comment, and it's one of the things, one of the observations I make as I listen and think about that point is that often in places that are fragile or conflict affected, the portfolio of work that a particular development agency might be doing in that country, or when you look across all the development agencies that are working in that country, the portfolio of work is comprised of projects, lots of projects, some focused on a particular strategic objective to improve the health system, let's say, another set of things designed to improve the economy and so forth. And then there might be a small number of projects focused on some aspect of peace building, or conflict management maybe. Somewhere in there, the people who work on those projects think, if we can just figure out a solution that works, to use your phrase, we'll get some traction. And more I'm becoming less certain of that. That it's actually not a project solution that works that we're after anymore. It's really a whole different approach, a whole different way of organizing our work in fragile states. That you've got to decide at the strategic level, at the highest strategic level, that in this country we are going to work on remedying a broken social contract in this place. And regardless of what sector we're going to work in, and we may choose to work in health and in the economy and education, let's be mindful throughout all those investments that our business is about fixing the social contract. And so instead of thinking about peace building programs sort of off to the side as those are the fragility programs, thinking about an integrated approach where the work on a broken social contract is being helped throughout the larger sectoral investments that are being made. And that gets us away from trying to think about the magic, I don't want to put it quite that way, but the right way that a project is going to be designed to finally crack the code on fragility. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think really what's going to happen is we decide we're going to approach our overall work in fragile states differently. And that'll be the way that we have a more transformative potential.
And maybe if I add one point to that, a reflection from Somalia. So, and again, not overnight, not simple, not universally loved as an approach. But what we've got to over a place in time is today, 80% for UNDP, 80% of our delivery is delivered jointly. That's through partnerships with the peacekeeping side, special political missions. That's with partnerships with humanitarian partners, and that, as Joe says, well, that wasn't something that could only be developed locally. So there, you need to have people that were committed to working together. You needed to have people that were committed to seeing things differently, even when there isn't any incentive for you to do that in your own performance, in your own fundraising, whatever. But still, people individually, overcame that and so committed locally. And there were a set of systems driven from different levels that facilitated a change in approach, both in terms of the way headquarters was dealing with the country, both in terms of the way people were implementing locally. I think that matters. A reflection from the policy side and how does that influence? I mean, I think from the policy, from donors, from an American government perspective, ask those questions. It was so important, those questions that were constantly asked of us in Somalia. Well, that's an interesting program on the rule of law. Who else are you working with? Is there a way of doing that together? How else could we imagine this? And of course, the New Deal is an important part of that as well. But anyway, just wanted to share that it eventually, it is possible, but it's really a combination of locally driven and then sort of systematic changes.
Well, thank you. We're just right on the dot. So I want to thank Ambassador Michel and our discussants, panelists, and for coming and for this thoughtful discussion. And thank you all for being here today.